When firefighters uncovered a hidden hallway beneath an old Oregon school, they expected rodents. What they found was something far worse. Locked rooms, name tags with no last names, and a dorm full of restraints. There were no records, no missing reports, because these kids were never meant to be remembered. But one girl escaped, and now she's telling everything. It started with smoke, a dense, bitter ribbon of it that curled into the pale Oregon morning, visible for miles above the tree line. Locals in Crooked River Ranch thought it might have been a controlled burn, something forestry-related, nothing to worry about. But by the time the fire trucks arrived, half the main building of the old Bramblegate Reform School had already collapsed inward. What remained stood like a blackened skeleton, its windows broken teeth, its roof peeled back to the beams. The site had been abandoned for over 20 years, shuttered after years of budget cuts and allegations no one ever pursued. People in town called it cursed. Teenagers dared each other to break in and tag the walls. But no one truly knew what Bramblegate had been. Not anymore. Not until that morning. While combing the debris, a firefighter named Lena Skarsgård noticed something strange. Beneath the scorched floor of what used to be the infirmary, her boot clanged against a metal grate. It wasn't ventilation. It was something heavier, deliberate, hidden under layers of ash and plywood. She called over 2 more crew members, and together they pried it open with crowbars and gloved hands. What they found wasn't a crawl space. It was a staircase, steel, narrow, leading down into darkness. A sealed sublevel, unmarked in the county blueprints. And it hadn't caught fire at all. The team descended slowly, their helmet lights cutting through thick cobwebs and stale air. The space below was cold, built of poured concrete. A long hallway stretched forward, with rusted doors lining each side. At first glance, it resembled a basement dorm, but the walls had scratches. The doors had locks on the outside, and one after another, the names began to appear, handwritten on old rosters, etched into the foot of metal beds. Dozens of them. Kids. Some of the rooms still had old clothing, a journal, dried paste in a tin bowl, and most disturbingly, restraints. Some leather, others chain-linked to metal rings bolted in the floor. Whatever this place had been, it wasn't abandoned in a hurry. It was sealed, intentionally. The media coverage didn't start for 3 more days. After photos leaked from the coroner's office showing what appeared to be medical equipment, vials of sedatives, and 32 hand-stamped name tags discovered inside the dorm. The tags bore first names only, along with what looked like identification codes. No last names. No social security records. Just numbers. Some as young as 5. None older than 14. That was when the old rumors surfaced again. Whispers that Bramblegate had been more than a reform school. That it was one of many behavioral redirection centers created during the 1960s and 70s. That children weren't just taught here, they were tested. The state tried to minimize. Said there were no existing death records. No reports of missing children matching the names. No physical remains found in the underground level. But that was a problem. There were no records at all. Not of enrollment. Not of transfers. Not of releases. And then, 5 days after the fire, a woman came forward. She was 34, slim, olive-skinned, wore a thrift hoodie and spoke with a flat, clean cadence of someone raised on silence. Her name was Tessa Lorne. She said she had lived in Bramblegate, that she had been locked in the basement, that she remembered her room number, the color of the hallway, and the exact sound of the ducted hiss that came before the lights shut off every night. She said she had escaped when she was 12, by hiding inside a laundry cart, and she said she was not the only one. The investigators didn't believe her at first. Tessa had no birth certificate prior to 1999, no traceable medical history before the age of 13, and no known relatives. She had been adopted by a couple in Northern California who claimed they found her in a youth crisis shelter with no memory of her past. But when state records were checked, no such shelter could be verified. Her identity trail began exactly where her trauma supposedly ended, just after she vanished from a place the state swore didn't exist. But Tessa knew things no outsider could. She described the layout of the sublevel, not in vague, dramatic terms, but with frightening precision. She sketched the twin corner rooms, the service elevator that had been welded shut, the dim green exit signs that never flickered because they weren't wired to the main grid. She described the smell of kerosene used to clean the floors, the plastic sheen of the sleeping mats, and the way one of the orderlies walked with a limp and always hummed the same classical tune, For Elise. When they showed her photographs from the recovered basement, she paused at one image, a carved word along the lower edge of a bed frame. 4 crooked letters burned into the metal with what looked like a soldering tool, KAYD. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, touched the image, and whispered, "He didn't make it." Tessa began to talk more after that. Not to the press, not to the state, but to a local journalist named Marion Sky, a former education beat reporter who had been trying for years to investigate rumors about state-funded behavioral redirection programs that operated in private under false education licenses. She met with Tessa in a diner booth near Bend, Oregon. They sat there for 3 hours. No recording, just notes. In that first conversation, Tessa revealed something no one had anticipated, that she remembered being transported in unmarked vans in the middle of the night, sometimes with other children who had no shoes, some who spoke no English, that food was given in powder packets, that they weren't called students. They were called trials. She remembered the code, T23. It was stitched into the lining of every shirt she wore. According to Tessa, Bramblegate wasn't meant to reform students. It was meant to erase them. Some were orphans. Others were pulled from foster systems, flagged as unmanageable. A few, she believed, had been taken from families told the children were being offered elite behavioral health programs in exchange for government stipends. She said once you were inside, there were no clocks, no contact, no voices raised above a whisper unless someone was being removed. No one ever knew what happened after someone was taken above, as the other children called it. The ground level was off-limits to the basement. The only door between them required a passcode none of the children ever knew. She said sometimes, when the lights went out, they would whisper stories about the ones who disappeared. Stories of syringes, of humming sounds, of small doors that locked from the outside. Some believed the children were adopted. Others thought they were moved to other facilities. But the older ones, the ones who had been in Bramblegate for more than a year, never spoke about those who vanished. They just stayed, blank, resigned. Tessa said she stayed alive by pretending to forget, by swallowing her reactions, by repeating what she was told to say during drills. She learned the rhythm of compliance, how to nod just fast enough, how to echo the phrases they demanded in the right tone. I am getting better. I understand the process. This is a safe place. If she said those words the wrong way, she didn't eat. When asked why she never spoke up before, she simply said, because no one would have believed me. And if I was wrong, if they were still out there, I would have put the rest of them in danger. Marion published a heavily redacted feature 2 weeks later, not naming Bramblegate outright, but detailing the fire, the sealed sublevel, and the untraceable name tags. The response was immediate, not just because of the horror it suggested, but because others began to reach out. Over the next 3 months, 7 people across 4 states contacted Marion, each claiming to have survived or been connected to facilities similar to the one Tessa described. One was a man in Idaho who remembered being driven blindfolded to a quiet school when he was 9, where he was told his parents didn't want him. Another was a woman in her 40s who said her younger brother vanished from a group home and was later found, years later, in a halfway house with no memory of how he got there, just the letters BR tattooed behind his ear. None of these cases had formal paper trails. No criminal charges were filed. Most of them were either dismissed or sealed during custody hearings. But they all shared the same eerie signature: children removed from public systems under the guise of special care, never to return. The federal investigation into Bramblegate was slow. Redacted records, missing files, conflicting names. The site had already been compromised by the fire, and most of the underground evidence was deemed inconclusive. Local officials blamed the loss of documentation on outdated systems. The foundation that had once owned Bramblegate, the Stonebridge Behavioral Alliance, no longer existed, dissolved in 2004 after a quiet merger with a private security consulting firm. Tessa was never officially recognized as a former resident, but she didn't need the recognition. She had scars, a small pocket line behind her left ear, from where, she claimed, they had inserted a monitoring device. She had dreams that left her vomiting on the floor. She had a precise recollection of dates, numbers, meal counts, door lock patterns. She also had names, 13 of them, her dorm mates. Only 2 had surnames. The rest were just first names and numbers. Cade, Miri, Thomas, Ellis, Bina. She wrote them on index cards and kept them in her coat pocket. Every day she read them aloud to herself. Not because she believed they were alive, but because she wanted someone to remember that they existed. Tessa never wanted fame. After the article went viral, journalists flooded her inbox. Talk shows called. True crime podcasters offered money. But she declined every request. She wasn't interested in being interviewed. She didn't want to be studied. All she asked for was a list, a comprehensive archive of every child who had been processed through state or county juvenile programs from 1975 to 1995. She wasn't trying to solve Bramblegate anymore. She was trying to find out if any of them had made it. She created a small website. It was crude, bare bones, with just one entry page titled Who Were We? Below that was a form. First name, approximate age, facility nickname, if remembered, any numbers or markings, and a question, do you remember the sublevel? In the first month, she received over 400 entries. Most were spam. Some were curious readers pretending. But then came a message from a woman in Montana. It read, "My name is Arden. I was T11. I remember the duct hiss. I remember Cade. I remember the small red sticker on the light switch that burned out. I thought I imagined you. Please write back." Tessa did. They spoke for hours over the course of a week. Arden remembered things Tessa didn't. The names of staff members, the sound of a particular voice that always asked the same question before lights out. Did you learn something today? She remembered the water pressure being shut off for days as punishment. She remembered a boy who kept trying to draw maps of the place, who was taken away after a staff member found his sketches. He never came back. Their accounts didn't just align. They were mirror images. Memories from inside the same steel box, told from opposite corners. Each had details the other didn't know until they shared them. Neither had spoken of it in decades. More messages came in. 2 former foster care workers, now retired, said they had placed children in educational clinics, but were told not to ask questions after drop-off. A former janitor sent a partial floor plan of the Bramblegate facility, showing an unlisted corridor behind the boiler room marked D3. He said he was paid in cash and told to enter only when called. And then a retired nurse from Portland reached out anonymously. She claimed she had worked for the Stonebridge Behavioral Alliance in the early 90s. Her role was injection oversight for therapeutic testing candidates. She said the children were not sedated unless they resisted, that many of them were simply too exhausted to resist anything. She sent Tessa a list of pharmaceutical labels she remembered, most of which had been discontinued or banned due to ethical concerns. One was marked Neuropromptex. Another was a drug designed to suppress IEM sleep. Tessa compiled everything, every scrap. She printed them, coded them, filed them in color-coded boxes. But she knew there would never be arrests. Too much time had passed. Too many hands had touched too little paper. The trail was cold, scattered, deniable, but memory was harder to erase. In 2023, she organized a gathering, not a protest, a memorial, held in the clearing where Bramblegate once stood. The fire had erased the building, but the sublevel remained, filled in with concrete by the county for safety. The site was surrounded by a low fence, and a rusted sign hung on the edge of the woods, property of Crooked River Municipal Trust. Tessa didn't care. She placed 13 small wooden markers at the perimeter, each one bearing a single name in black ink. Cade, Miri, Bina, Thomas, Ellis. Each one held a small glass jar with a candle inside. By dusk, nearly 50 people had gathered. Some brought photos. Some brought only silence. Arden stood beside Tessa. She held a notebook. On its cover was a sticker with a red line through the word erased. They lit the candles. One by one, no speeches, no signs, just flame and breath and the slow settling of a name that had not been spoken in years, and still might not be found in any file. Later that night, Marion Sky published a final article. She didn't name the attendees. She didn't restate the horrors. She simply wrote this. Some systems are designed to leave no fingerprints. But not every child forgotten is truly gone. Not while someone remembers how they spoke, or who they held hands with in the dark. The school tried to erase them, but memory burns hotter than fire. And still, the site sits quiet. The wind moves through the trees, and the concrete beneath the earth holds its secrets. But sometimes, on quiet nights, hikers say they hear something beneath the gravel, a sound like hissing pipes and the thrum of unseen electricity. Others say it's just the wind. But the survivors know better. They remember the silence that came before the sound, and they will never stop saying the names. 3 months after the vigil, Marion received a thick manila envelope in her mailbox. It wasn't marked with a return address, but the postmark was from Salem. Inside was a set of photocopied medical records, old, yellowed form stamped with a Stonebridge Behavioral Alliance insignia. No names, just initials. Dozens of pages detailing treatments, injections, and behavioral scoring systems labeled with numbers and acronyms that had no explanation. On the final page was a typed line that read, "Discharge not recommended. Subject remains malleable under code 7 theta." It wasn't the first leak she'd received, but it was the first one that came with a second envelope. That one contained a Polaroid photo. Blurry, faded. It showed 4 children standing in a gray room wearing identical uniforms. No expressions. Behind them, a man in a surgical mask. Marion spent days comparing that photo to the evidence photos taken during the Bramblegate site excavation. One of the uniforms had the same patch, a hexagon stitch into the upper left chest, barely visible in the Polaroid but unmistakable in pattern. She called Tessa. Tessa stared at the image for a long time before saying, "That's the intake chamber. We were taken there before they shaved our heads." Marion asked if she recognized the kids. Tessa only recognized one, the girl second from the right. She said her name had been Miri, the same name written on one of the 13 wooden markers. That photograph gave the investigation new life. After publishing it, redacted and with careful caveats, Marion was contacted by a former electrical contractor who claimed he had helped install a subterranean light isolation grid at a private school facility in the mid-'80s. He remembered the project vividly because it had required silence, non-disclosure, and working exclusively at night. He had only been allowed on site once. He described long corridors, faint music playing in the background, and one moment when a door creaked open and he saw a child staring at him through a small glass window, shaved head, expressionless. He said nothing at the time. He was 22, scared, underpaid. He told himself it must have been a temporary medical facility. Now he wasn't so sure. More people came forward. 2 former Stonebridge interns, a nurse who had left the profession entirely after her 3-month rotation, and an unnamed juvenile health lab. She had been told the children were nonverbal trauma survivors, that they required strict routine and absolute quiet. But the part that haunted her, the part she had locked away for years, was that none of the children ever made noise. Not even when they fell. Not even when they bled. Their silence wasn't trauma. It was training. Tessa, meanwhile, had begun compiling an unofficial registry. With the help of volunteers, she built what she called a forgotten archive, a spreadsheet listing over 200 names, dates, initials, and known or rumored locations of suspected behavioral facilities matching Bramblegate structure. Most were shuttered. Some had been converted into juvenile court annexes. A few were now high-end wellness centers. But the blueprint was the same: rural, unlisted dorms, out-of-state funding, and no public records beyond their incorporation filings. She shared the archive with a nonprofit focused on institutional abuse survivors. They were skeptical at first, but then one of their researchers found something. In 1991, a class action suit had been quietly filed and dismissed against Stonebridge in Utah. The plaintiffs were 3 siblings who claimed they had been removed from foster care, separated, and enrolled in something called a compliance re-education initiative. The case was thrown out for lack of documentation, but the filing listed a facility address that matched one of the sites in Tessa's archive. That case had never been reported publicly, but it proved something that no one had been able to prove yet. The system had cracked before. It had bled, just not enough to kill it. Tessa wanted more than exposure. She wanted accountability. So she went to the Oregon State Legislature. With a team of lawyers and the support of several trauma-informed advocacy groups, she presented her findings, anonymized testimonies, photos, the floor plan from the janitor, even the audio recordings from Arden describing specific details from the basement dorm that matched the excavation images. At first, lawmakers listened politely. But the moment came when Tessa handed them one final piece of evidence, a child drawing found in the Bramblegate sublevel. It had been preserved in a sealed Ziploc bag, buried under mattress, crayon on brown paper. It showed a door with a red light. Behind it, stick figures with excess over their mouths. Above the drawing were the words, "No sound equals good." No one spoke for a full minute after seeing it. That drawing became the front page of the Oregonian 2 days later. The hearings were reopened. An independent inquiry was launched, and Tessa was named as one of the official survivor representatives on the advisory panel. But still, no arrests, no charges, only questions. Why were there no state audits of Stonebridge? Why did the facilities share architectural similarities? Who funded the construction of an underground dorm with Novak? And the most disturbing, how many more are still out there, forgotten by file, protected by paper, but remembered by someone still breathing? The federal investigation, when it finally arrived, didn't come with fanfare or flashing badges. It came in the form of quiet subpoenas, whispered interviews, and heavily redacted communications. The Department of Health and Human Services had opened a historical review of juvenile care facilities dating back to the late 1970s. On the surface, it appeared routine. But inside, a dedicated task force was quietly assembled, operating under a confidential code name, Project Candlelock. It was composed of forensic archivists, retired state auditors, and 2 veteran federal agents with prior experience investigating abuse within youth detention centers. Their job wasn't to prosecute, not yet, but to trace funding streams, locate missing records, and uncover the extent of Bramblegate's network. What they found over the next 9 months would confirm what survivors like Tessa had insisted for years. Bramblegate wasn't a one-off. It was a node. Candlelock's early focus was on tracking the money. They found that Stonebridge Behavioral Alliance had received intermittent federal grants, but not directly. The funds were funneled through shell organizations with vaguely benevolent names like the Harmony Education Trust and Youth Renewal Foundation. Most were registered in Delaware. Some didn't even list physical addresses. But all of them had one thing in common. They listed therapeutic redirection as a central mission. Over 100 facilities across 14 states had received funding through these intermediaries between 1982 and 1996. Many no longer existed. Some had become residential treatment centers with new branding. But Candlelock found fragments, invoices for bunk cots shipped to unknown locations, blueprints for low-stimulus isolation pods, medical supply orders for experimental drugs never approved by the FDA. Still, they lacked a smoking gun until they got lucky. In a warehouse in upstate New York scheduled for demolition, a forgotten shipping container was found during cleanup. Inside were dozens of unfiled storage boxes labeled SBA Archive. Most were water damaged, but one box, sealed in plastic, was intact. Inside, personnel files, handwritten notes, schedules, and a set of photographic ID cards, laminated and faded but still legible. Each ID had a first name, a number, and a month-year notation. No last names, no issuing authority, but the dates aligned with the Bramblegate timeline. One of the IDs was labeled T23 as September 91. The photo, though distorted, unmistakably resembled a young Tessa. When shown the photo by federal agents, she didn't speak for a full minute. Then she nodded. That was me. The photo was a breakthrough Candlelock needed. With it, they traced other IDs to 2 additional facilities in New Mexico and West Virginia, both now long shut down. But in West Virginia, in a state archive facility, they discovered a fire-damaged intake roster. The list was fragmented, some entries blackened beyond legibility. But one column survived, the trial number column. It contained 87 entries. Tessa read the list in stunned silence. 3 names jumped out at her immediately. Miri, Cade, Bina. The case went public. A joint press conference was held between HHS and the Department of Justice. Phrases like systemic negligence, failure of oversight, and moral catastrophe were used, but no admissions of illegality. There was no formal apology, only an acknowledgement that record had been lost or intentionally destroyed, and a commitment to ensuring such breakdowns never happen again. But survivors wanted more than statements. They wanted names. They wanted to know who built the system that hurt them. The media dubbed it the vanishing school scandal. Podcasts dissected it. Documentaries began pre-production. But Tessa stayed mostly silent. She didn't want to be part of the media storm. She wanted answers. So she started writing letters. To every governor whose state hosted a suspected site. To the families of children who might never know they were part of something buried. To janitors, cafeteria workers, old bookkeepers, anyone who might have touched a record, unlocked a door, heard a scream. Some letters went unanswered. Others came back with cryptic responses, hints at memory suppressed, record shredded, orders given from nameless supervisors. But one letter came with coordinates. A former groundskeeper from a Wyoming facility wrote a single note. They never used real names. But check beneath the south shed. We buried a box there in '92. Told it was just garbage. I don't think it was. Tessa and Arden traveled there together. It was late autumn. Snow threatened the sky. They found the property abandoned, the fence partially collapsed. With a hand shovel and borrowed metal detector, they searched for 2 days. On the third day, they found it, a rusted metal box. Inside, cassette tapes. Dozens, labeled only by dates. One played sound. Low quality, scratchy, but unmistakable. A voice, male, repeating, "Good morning, trial 48. Are you ready to comply today?" Then a child's voice, no older than 6. "Yes, sir." Silence. Then a buzz. Then another voice. Assessment begins. Tessa sat down in the snow and wept, not because she recognized the voices, but because it proved they hadn't imagined it, that the ghosts had voices, and those voices had been recorded, and now they would be heard. The tapes ignited a firestorm. They were handed directly to the Department of Justice under federal whistleblower protection. Though badly degraded, several were still partially audible. In total, 31 tapes contained over 10 hours of dialogue, ambient facility noise, and timed interaction sequences between staff and children. The DOJ confirmed their authenticity within days, and though the public never heard the full recordings, excerpts leaked, enough to trigger outrage, disbelief, and fear. What the tapes revealed was far worse than silence or neglect. They revealed scripting. Children were being conditioned to repeat specific language patterns in response to psychological cues. Not just obedience training, but speech framing, rehearsed phrases, simulated conversations, and what appeared to be emotional neutralization trials. Some responses were whispered, others shouted, all logged, timed, and reinforced with unseen consequences. One tape included a child saying, "I will correct the error. I will not remember what I saw." That line repeated 3 times. Each time, softer. Another featured what seemed to be a test scenario where a staff voice asked, "If the man in white says you were never here, what do you say?" The child hesitated. Then, "I was never here." There was no scream, no crying, just cold repetition. The media seized on this. Cable outlets dubbed the program erasure therapy. Painless debated whether it constituted experimentation, indoctrination, or something darker. But survivors like Tessa knew what it was. It was control. Public reaction turned volcanic. Protesters gathered outside old Stonebridge-linked buildings with signs reading, "You buried children." Who signed the papers? And asked Tessa. Hashtags like #trial23 and #remembercade began trending globally. But behind closed doors, the momentum faltered. Despite mounting evidence, no single person could be held responsible. The chain of custody for the children was so fragmented that no one could prove who gave orders, signed contracts, or designed protocols. Everything had been privatized, outsourced, and lost behind expired shell companies. The best the DOJ could offer was a civil settlement. It totaled $32 million, distributed among 67 verified survivors who came forward under candle lock. Most accepted the compensation under silence clauses, but not Tessa, not Arden, not three others who refused the money entirely. They didn't want it. They wanted something else, a name, so they began their own inquiry, independently, using the network of journalists, archivists, and citizen researchers who had gathered around the story like orbiting planets. They hunted patents, traced consulting firms, and cross-referenced architectural documents. They followed breadcrumbs others had missed. And one night, they found a name in a forgotten conference paper from 1983. Dr. Linwood Marsden, psychiatric researcher, specialized in child behavioral desensitization. He had spoken at a government-funded symposium on non-invasive institutional conditioning. The transcript included chilling language. Long-term redirection programs are most effective when the subject no longer perceives themselves as displaced, but rather recoded. Marsden was never charged with a crime, because he had been dead since 1994. But in his notes, which surfaced later through FOIA requests, he wrote one line that connected everything. For children who cannot be reached, we must instead teach them to disappear. Those words became a rallying cry. A foundation was created, named after the phrase survivors had whispered in the dark, "No sound equals good." Its mission was to track and expose legacy institutions tied to silent trauma, to give names back to the nameless, and to preserve the voices once buried by cement and silence. In 2025, a national memorial was proposed in Oregon. At first, it faced resistance. Local officials said it would invite controversy, that the town had suffered enough. But public support overwhelmed them. Hundreds of thousands signed petitions. Survivors marched quietly through Crooked River Ranch wearing simple shirts, each printed with only one word: trial. The land where Bramblegate once stood was transformed, not into a museum, not into a ruin, but into a grove. Each tree planted bore a metal tag, not with a donor's name, but with a trial number and a single chosen word by the survivors. Cade's read, "Listen." Bina's read, "Still here." Miri's read, "Never again." Tessa's, by her own request, read only, "Remember." There was no ceremony, only silence. But this time, it was not the kind used to bury the truth. This silence was chosen, a piece held together by remembrance, lit by candles, and carried in the trembling voices of the once forgotten, no longer erased, no longer alone, and never again voiceless.